Hey guys, tonight we wade into a world where a muddy pond, filled with sluggish, whiskered fish, can actually measure the wealth of an entire household. You stand at the edge of a medieval manor, your shoes sinking slightly into damp earth. In the fading light, the surface of the carp pond glimmers like liquid bronze, every ripple betraying the quiet life beneath. A frog croaks lazily from the rushes, and somewhere beyond the water, monks in brown robes are watching, hands clasped, muttering about how many days of Lent still stretch ahead. Carp, of all things, were considered a treasure. Not quite jewels, not gold, but a delicacy with prestige. You probably won't survive this age, honestly. Between the lack of modern plumbing, the questionable medical practices, and the fact that people thought fermented herring brine was a valid sauce ingredient. Still, here you are, imagining the cool mist, the faint smell of mud, the faint gurgle of water being sluiced into a man-made pond. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The monks begin the story. In early medieval Europe, especially in Benedictine monasteries, you're bound by strict fasting rules. Meat from warm-blooded animals is forbidden on countless days of the year. That leaves fish, which swims just neatly outside the no-meat restriction. Suddenly, keeping ponds brimming with carp isn't just convenient. It's salvation on a platter. One mainstream historical fact here. By the 12th century, monastic orders across Germany, Bohemia, and France were already specialists at engineering ponds and canals to breed carp. You might think fish just swim around until someone nets them. But no, carp were chosen because they're patient little survivors. They tolerate low oxygen, muddy water, even being hauled across long distances in barrels with moss and damp cloth. The quirky tidbit: carp were so adaptable that some monasteries swore their fish had learned to respond to the sound of the dinner bell, swimming toward the bank like obedient puppies. As you lean over the water's edge, picture the wealth signified here. A carp pond is more than protein. It's a flex. You can't just dig a hole and wait. It takes dikes, sluices, rights to divert a stream. If you had the money to shape land into watery rectangles and stock them, you were broadcast into the neighborhood. I can afford to feed fish for months, just so I can eat them fat later. Historians still argue whether carp ponds began mainly as symbols of abundance or a sheer necessity born of endless fast days. Perhaps, as always, it was a little of both. The soundscape is half idyllic, half smelly. You imagine reeds brushing your legs, ducks quacking indignantly, the faint buzz of mosquitoes. There's mud squelching between your toes if you dare to step in. But you're not allowed to forget, this watery rectangle is an economic statement. Some records even show carp ponds being mentioned in dowry agreements, like, "Congratulations, you're marrying into 3 fine ponds, fully stocked." And monks? They had a knack for chronicling everything, from the number of fish to the temperature of the water. They also sprinkled in small legends, like one monastery where a giant carp supposedly lived for over a century, passed down like a soggy family heirloom. Was it true? Almost certainly not. But the legend made every visitor peer anxiously into water, half expecting a gray, whiskered patriarch to rise. For a moment, imagine yourself drifting off by the bank, lying back on the grass. You're listening to the breeze, half watching ripples, half not. The very ordinariness of fish farming becomes oddly soothing. And yet, under the sleepy surface, carp were status. They fed kings, bishops, abbots, and lords. They flavored stews at banquets and gave peasants something to dream about. You sense why this slow, shimmering creature became the aquatic gold of its time. So, as twilight deepens over the manor, your eyelids grow heavier. The carp continue their slow dance, weaving through silt and shadow, utterly unaware that their very existence is shaping prestige, wealth, and diets across centuries. You shuffle forward along the pond's grassy edge, and already you can tell this water isn't just for show, it's for taste. In a world where refrigeration doesn't exist, preserving flavor is as much a luxury as the flavor itself. The medieval palate, far from being simple, is obsessed with layers. Think ginger, cinnamon, saffron, and clove tossed into savory broths. Now imagine all those spices embracing the tender flesh of a carp. Suddenly, you're not staring into muddy water. You're staring at liquid wealth simmering beneath the surface. When medieval lords hosted banquets, the food wasn't simply nourishment, it was theater. You're sitting at one of those endless oak tables, candlelight dancing, shadows stretching across stone walls. Platters arrive with roast swans, pies shaped like castles, and yes, bowls of carp, prepared with a sort of flair that would make a Michelin inspector nod. The mainstream historical fact here. Carp became particularly valued in late medieval century Europe, where nobles demanded them on the feast table alongside venison and game birds. The sheer volume of recipes for carp in 15th century German cookbooks proves they weren't just a side dish. They were a centerpiece. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some cooks would actually paint carp with saffron glaze, so the fish gleamed golden on the table. Nothing says, "My pond is fatter than yours," like a fish that looks like it swam through Fort Knox. It's a little gaudy, but hey, subtlety wasn't a strong suit of medieval feasts. You lean back in your chair, chewing slowly. The meat of carp is firm, a little oily, with a mild sweetness. But what matters isn't the taste alone, it's the brag. Having carp meant you had ponds, which meant you had land, servants, and control of water. You could afford to wait a whole year for a fish to fatten, while peasants down the lane couldn't even keep chickens safe from tax collectors. And taste mattered because feasts were competitions. Each noble host wanted dishes that whispered, or rather shouted, power. Carp held up well against the strong spices of the time, which were also luxury imports. So you're not just tasting fish, you're tasting the Silk Road itself. Pepper from India, cloves from the Moluccas, saffron from Spain, vinegar from French vineyards, all married with a fish raised right there in your muddy backyard pond. Historians still argue whether medieval diners genuinely appreciated the subtle flavor of carp itself, or whether the point was simply to serve a canvas for expensive spices. Picture the banter. A knight across the table leans over, smirks, and says, "My carp were twice the weight of this when we feasted last month." Everyone chuckles, then notes the jab. Reputation swims in the stew as much as the fish. And then there's the sensory comedy. Carp have those whiskery barbels on their faces, like mustaches. Imagine a platter arriving, the fish staring blankly upward with its little mustache intact. You take a bite, pretending not to notice. Joke number 1. Medieval guests didn't need comedians. Sometimes the entree itself brought the humor. Joke number 2 arrives as you watch a poor servant lug a barrel of live carp through the hall. The fish slosh, one leaps, and the servant shrieks like he's been attacked by a sea dragon. Nobles laugh into their goblets. The fish lands back in the barrel with an undignified splash. Joke number 3, it's the smell. Let's be honest, no matter how much saffron glaze you slap on, fish smell like fish. So here you are, surrounded by aristocrats pretending that the scent of carp stew is as refined as rose water. You can't help smirking, thinking, yeah, right, that's definitely eau de prestige. But still, the banquet cement carp as culinary status. Think of them as the Wagyu beef of medieval Europe. Only instead of marbleized steaks sizzling, you've got golden glazed fish with whiskers. And every guest notices. Carp ponds become investments. Kitchens become laboratories. And taste becomes a weapon in the subtle wars of noble prestige. And you, reclining in your candlelit haze, realize you're not just eating dinner. You're tasting centuries of power struggles distilled into a single slippery fish. You wander now from the echoing banquet hall back toward the cloistered stone walls of a monastery, where meals are quieter, simpler, and yet no less obsessed with fish. Picture yourself seated at a long wooden refectory table. The room is hushed except for the faint scrape of spoons, the crackle of fire in the hearth, and the shuffle of sandals across flagstone floors. The monks bow their heads, and before them lies not a roast goose or dripping venison, but a steaming bowl of carp. Here's the reality. In the medieval church calendar, more than half the year was designated as fasting or abstinence days. That meant no meat from warm-blooded animals. But fish, cold-blooded and slippery, was conveniently categorized as permissible. This is your mainstream historical fact. Carp, being freshwater and abundant if cultivated, became a cornerstone of monastic diets in Central and Eastern Europe by the 13th century. The monks weren't munching steak, while everyone else starved. Instead, their survival strategy was a web of ponds dug around abbeys, each stocked carefully with carp. To them, fish was meatless meat, a way to obey the letter of fasting law while still filling bellies with protein. And protein was necessary, because chanting psalms, copying manuscripts, and trudging out to the fields burns more calories than you'd think. Now here comes a quirky tidbit. Some monasteries named their favorite carp. Imagine Brother Anselm whispering to another, "Don't catch old Gregory. He's been with us since Abbot Bernard's time." Of course, carp rarely live that long in ponds without ending up in soup, but the sentimental attachment is there. In some places, monks even train carp to swim toward the feeding bell, making them oddly like aquatic pets that eventually became dinner. As you listen to the clink of spoons, it's clear this isn't just food. It's theology on a plate. By eating carp, the monks reinforce their obedience while still bending rules enough to remain nourished. Historians still argue whether the emphasis was truly spiritual discipline or pragmatic loopholing. Did monks cultivate fish because they saw divine symbolism in carp, patience, silence, humility, or because they really just wanted to avoid gnawing on turnips for months on end? You watch Brother Thomas sip broth, then smirk. His beard drips a little, and he wipes it with his sleeve. That's joke number one. Even holy men couldn't escape the indignity of fish soup mustaches. Joke number two plays out at the pond itself. Imagine a gaggle of monks in sandals, chasing a carp with nets, slipping in the mud, robes billowing, splashing about like children at recess. The fish darts, the monks curse under their breath, and one unlucky brother falls flat on his back in the muck. The others laugh. Then remember they're supposed to be solemn. Joke number three arrives when you picture Lent stretching for 40 long days. Carp again and again and again. You can almost hear the groans. Not carp stew again, brother? It's like the medieval version of eating instant noodles every day in college. Comforting the first week, maddening by week 5. But for all the mild grumbling, carp held deep value. The ponds outside weren't just functional. They were symbols of monastic independence. The abbey could feed itself without relying entirely on peasants or markets. A full pond meant full stomachs. A drained pond meant hardship. And monks, pragmatic as ever, guarded their ponds like treasure. You glance across the table and see a painted manuscript illustration propped on a stand. It shows a haloed saint holding a fish. Is it a miracle or just an illustration of a very good dinner? The blurred line between theology and appetite is deliciously medieval. The rhythm of life at the abbey beats steadily. Prayer, work, reading, and meals that circle back again and again to the humble carp. And you, drifting into drowsy half-awareness, sense that these fish are more than a dish. They are continuity, calendar, ritual, and quiet luxury, swimming steadily beneath the surface of medieval spirituality. You leave behind the cloister walls and step into manicured grounds of a noble estate. The evening sun paints the horizon in streaks of copper, and ahead of you stretches not a field of grain, but a glittering expanse of water, broad and rectangular, reflecting the manor's towers. This is no natural pond. It's a deliberate design, carved and managed with care, as much a symbol as the tapestries hanging in the Great Hall. Here lies your mainstream historical fact. By the later Middle Ages, landscape fish ponds became a hallmark of aristocratic estates across Central and Western Europe. These weren't random puddles. They were engineered features, integrated with gardens, orchards, and hunting parks. A nobleman with ponds wasn't just feeding his household. He was advertising control over nature itself. The fish pond was a stage. Guests wandering the grounds would see a mirror-like surface where carp lurked beneath. You could imagine Lord saying, "Look, I can make water obey, and in it, fish grow fat for my table." It was landscaping with dinner included. Carp ponds set alongside flower beds and dovecots, creating an estate where every element whispered wealth. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some nobles designed ponds in shapes, stars, crosses, even the initials of their family name, visible only from above. Of course, no medieval guest had a drone to appreciate it. But the sheer audacity of thinking, let's sculpt the land in my monogram, says everything about ego. It's a status symbol carved in mud and water. You stroll along the embankment, reeds brushing your hands. The air smells faintly metallic, the scent of stagnant water. Noble ladies in flowing gowns drift by, pointing at the ripples, commenting on the serenity of the carp. But serenity required armies of workers dredging mud, hauling stones, and maintaining sluices. A pond was both spectacle and labor machine. Historians still argue whether the primary function was really food production or prestige display. Was a fish pond essentially a medieval lawn ornament? Alive, slippery, and expensive? Joke number one emerges when you imagine a pompous lord inviting guests to admire his pond, only for everyone to gag as a gust of wind delivers the overpowering smell of algae bloom. Ah yes, the perfume of success. Joke number two. Picture carp leaping unexpectedly, splashing muddy water onto a lady's gown worth more than a peasant's yearly rent. The silence afterward will be thick enough to ladle. Joke number three hides in the sheer impracticality. Digging and maintaining ponds cost a fortune, yet nobles insisted, because prestige demanded it. It's like buying a luxury car that constantly breaks down. Except instead of mechanic, you hire peasants with shovels. As you wander farther, you notice how ponds slide into the choreography of estate life. A visiting dignitary might tour the aviary, admire falcons, stroll through rose gardens, and then pause at the water's edge, nodding approvingly at the glint of carp. Later, those same fish appear on platters at dinner, tying the outdoor spectacle directly to the feast indoors. The pond, therefore, was theater twice over, once for the eyes, once for the palate. And in that muddy rectangle, medieval society projected its dreams of order. Nature subdued, beauty shaped, wealth made edible. The carp swim lazily, oblivious that their watery stage is a mirror of their master's ambition. You pause, take in the still water, and let the image settle. Behind you, the manor's windows glow, voices echo faintly, and in front of you the pond lies like a sheet of hammered bronze. It is both practical pantry and ornamental mirror, a contradiction floating gently under the medieval sun. You linger by the pond and notice a servant approaching with a wicker basket, the smell wafting ahead of him long before the contents are visible. Inside are kitchen scraps, stale bread crusts, chopped cabbage stalks, and whatever leftovers weren't polished off from yesterday's meal. With a flick of his wrist, he scatters them across the water. Instantly, the pond erupts in ripples. Carp push upward, broad mouths gaping like small vacuums, sucking down every morsel with exaggerated gulps. This is your mainstream historical fact. Carp were not only resilient, but also easily fattened on human scraps. They turned waste into dinner, a cycle medieval households found immensely practical. A carp pond meant no crumb went to waste. Bread crusts that would rot in a bin instead became tomorrow's feast swimming in mud. And here's the quirky tidbit. Nobles sometimes stage feeding shows for guests. Imagine walking with a lord through manicured gardens until he suddenly shouts, "Watch this!" A servant tosses food into pond, and dozens of carp surge forward, thrashing, leaping, mouths opening and closing like eager dogs. Guests gasp, clap politely, and perhaps stifle a giggle at the absurdity of fish turning into a waterborne circus act. Feeding carp wasn't just maintenance, it was entertainment. You lean over the bank, and the noise is almost comic. Carp don't nibble delicately. They slurp, chomp, and splash. The spectacle is strangely mesmerizing, and the sound carries, drawing curious eyes from the manor windows. Feeding time is communal, a ritual that turns humble kitchen waste into a performance of abundance. But don't think it was all leisure. Carp required consistent care. Too little feeding, and they stayed small. Too much, and the pond turned foul. Balancing scraps with pond health was an art as much as a chore. Historians still argue whether feeding routines were overseen directly by the noble household or delegated entirely to peasants. Some accounts suggest lords took pride in showing off fat fish, meaning they likely micromanaged carp meals more than they admitted. Joke number one. Picture a noble boasting about his carp, only for the fish to completely ignore the scraps during a demonstration, leaving him red-faced as the pond lies still. Joke number two. Peasants sometimes toss scraps so casually that duck stole most of it before carp even surfaced. You can imagine a frustrated servant muttering, "We're feeding poultry soup again this year." Joke number 3, the sound. If you close your eyes, those gaping mouths sucking in bread make the same noise as someone slurping noodles. Imagine a chorus of aquatic slurps echoing across the estate. Less elegant than intended. Still, feeding carp was woven into the estate's daily rhythm. Bread baked in the morning, crust returned to water by evening, fish fattened slowly through the seasons. It was a quiet circle of reuse, long before recycling slogans made it fashionable. You picture yourself tossing a handful of scraps, watching the feeding frenzy unfold. The water churns, reeds sway, droplets glitter in the air like jewels. For a moment, you almost laugh at the absurdity of this ritual of refinement, yet you can't deny it's strangely soothing. The pond, alive with thrashing carp, reflects both human ingenuity and human vanity. As the frenzy subsides, the water stills again as if nothing happened. Beneath the surface, bellies are fuller, and the cycle of prestige and practicality continues. Tomorrow, more scraps will come, and the fish will rise once again, slurping their way into history. The seasons turn slowly over your shoulder, and now the pond is rimmed with frost. Winter has arrived, and with it, rituals that look equal parts practical and theatrical. The surface of the pond glistens with a crust of ice. Servants trudge out in heavy cloaks, carrying axes and iron bars. You watch as they hack through the frozen skin of the water, sending shards flying like glass. Beneath, the carp stir sluggishly, surviving on their reserves, their movement slowed to a dreamy drift. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medieval estates often cut holes in ice to keep carp ponds aerated during winter. Without those air pockets, the fish could suffocate, trapped under a solid lid of ice. Maintaining the pond through frost wasn't optional. It was life and death for the household's aquatic pantry. And then spring comes, bringing its own ritual, the draining of ponds. Picture the sluice gates creaking open, water rushing out into channels, mud sucking downward. Servants wade knee-deep into muck, nets stretched, grabbing thrashing carp by the dozens. This harvest cleared out silt, removed parasites, and reset the pond. The quirky tidbit. Draining often turned into a muddy carnival. Kids splashed in the muck. Women carried baskets of wriggling fish. And even lords sometimes strutted down to inspect their haul, boots sinking as they pretended to oversee. You stand there, hearing the squelch of mud, the laughter, and the occasional shriek when someone slips and disappears waist-deep. Carp flop on the bank, silver scales glinting, as workers sort the fattest ones to the Lord's table and return smaller fry to the water. It's labor, yes, but also a festival of sorts. Half necessity, half communal event. Historians still argue whether these seasonal rituals were primarily about efficiency or about display. Was draining the pond merely good husbandry, or was it another excuse for nobles to parade wealth? After all, the sight of servants hauling baskets of live carp made a better show than any embroidered tapestry. Joke number 1. Imagine a nobleman insisting on wading into the drain pond to prove his vigor, only to lose a boot in the mud. Dignity gone, the laughter of peasants muffled behind bowed heads. Joke number 2. In some places, draining ponds revealed not just fish but lost items, spoons, jewelry, the occasional boot. Picture a servant triumphantly holding up a rusty dagger, shouting, "Treasure," while everyone groans. Joke number 3. Carp are slippery, and a full-grown one can wriggle right out of your grasp. You can almost hear the frustrated curses as fish after fish slaps free and flops back into the muck, leaving catchers sprawled in the mud like clowns. Season after season, this cycle repeats. Winter ice cuttings, spring drainings, summer feedings, autumn harvests. Each step becomes tradition, a slow choreography linking nature, work, and feasting. You, standing at the edge, realize you stumbled upon a medieval calendar written not in parchment but in mud and scales. And as the carp settle once more into their replenished pond, the estate breathes easy. Another cycle complete. Another year secured. The fish swim lazily, unaware that their yearly drama is also the heartbeat of prestige, survival, and spectacle. You leave behind the noble's estate and wander toward the edge of a village, where cottages huddle close, smoke curling from low chimneys. Beyond the hedgerows, fields stretch out, patched with rye, barley, and the occasional cabbage. A handful of peasants stand near the manor's pond, not daring to step too close. Their eyes follow the ripples with quiet longing, hands rough from work, bellies often empty. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, peasants rarely tasted carp, even though they might live right beside the ponds. These fish were reserved for lords, monasteries, and feast days. The village diet was rooted in grains, pottage, and whatever small animals could be caught or raised, chickens, maybe a pig if fortune smiled. The glimmering carp were like edible gold locked behind invisible walls. Now, the quirky tidbit. There are tales of peasants sneaking bits of stale bread to toss into the pond, not to feed the fish, but simply to watch them surface. It was entertainment in a life with precious little luxury. Imagine a child giggling as the whiskered mouse rose, even though everyone knew those fish would never end up in their bowls. You picture the contrast. In the manor, the carp feast with saffron and cinnamon. In the cottage, dinner is thin porridge, maybe salted herring if luck holds. The peasants stare, a mix of envy and resignation, watching whales swim in circles while their own fields yield only just enough to scrape by. Historians still argue whether carp ponds were truly symbols of oppression or simply accepted features of feudal life. Did peasants resent the ponds, or did they marvel at them as distant wonders they'd never taste? Joke number 1. Imagine a hungry peasant muttering, "If I ever come back as a fish, let be in the Lord's pond, not the miller's ditch." Joke number 2. A boy dares his friend to jump in and catch one barehanded. He splashes, flails, and emerges covered in mud, but without so much as a single scale. The laughter echoes, even as the manor guard shouts them away. Joke number 3. Picture a family sharing stories by the hearth, joking that the Lord's carp probably live better than they do. Warm pond, endless bread, no taxes. It's gallows humor, but it gets a chuckle. And yet, for all the distance, peasants understood the prestige tied to those ponds. When a carp was served in the village, maybe at a festival, maybe gifted by the Lord at Christmas, it became an event to remember. Stories lingered long after the taste faded. Tales of that one time we ate like nobles. So you stand there with them, watching the shimmer of scales beneath the water. Hunger and awe mingle in the air. The pond is a mirror of inequality, yes, but also a reminder of how food can be more than sustenance. It can be aspiration, envy, and a dream swimming just out of reach. You step away from the hungry gazes of the villagers and walk toward the pond's edge again, where the true machinery of prestige reveals itself. Engineering. A carp pond isn't just a hole filled with water. It's a carefully built system of dikes, channels, and sluices. You pause at the wooden gate that controls the flow, its timbers dark with moss and age. The faint creak of water pressing against it becomes a constant, sleepy rhythm in the background. Here's the mainstream historical fact. By the 14th century, pond construction had become a serious craft. Engineers designed networks of ponds, sometimes tiered so that water drained from one end to the next. Each pond served a purpose, spawning, growing, fattening. Together, they formed aquatic farms that could feed entire monasteries or manors. These weren't accidents of nature. They were deliberate landscapes of control. And the quirky tidbit? Maintenance was a muddy nightmare. Each year, workers scraped silt from the bottoms with long-handled scoops, hauling muck into carts. That muck, however, was considered excellent fertilizer for fields. So, while lords brag about fish, peasants quietly rejoice at the stinking sludge dumped onto their crops. Carp ponds literally fertilize prestige. You wade imaginatively into the process. First, sluices release water, and you hear the rush as it pours into side channels. Then, nets are stretched across narrowing pools. Workers slosh waist-deep, their tunics clinging, dragging muck, swearing softly as eels or frogs slip past their fingers. The smell, earthy, sharp, briny, fills your nose. And always, the nobleman stands above it all, nodding with satisfaction, as though he himself had lifted a single scoop of mud. Historians still argue whether pond engineers were primarily peasants trained on the job, or whether there was a genuine professional class of water masters. Some records suggest traveling specialists designed complex pond systems for multiple estates. earning reputations akin to master masons or carpenters. Joke number 1. Imagine a lord boasting about his ponds, only for the sluice gate to jam. The workers strain, sweat, and finally the gate bursts open, drenching everyone, including the lord, with icy water. Prestige takes a soggy blow. Joke number 2. Draining ponds expose more than fish. Archaeologists sometimes find lost kitchenware, coins, even bones. Picture a peasant triumphantly holding up a chamber pot, shouting, "Treasure!" while everyone groans. Joke number 3. Carp aren't exactly cooperative. In the draining chaos, one might slip between a worker's legs and send him sprawling backward into muck, flailing like a turtle on its shell. His friends laugh until they too are knocked over by another slippery escapee. And yet, this muddy labor mattered. A pond that wasn't maintained could silt up, suffocate fish, or collapse a dike. To keep carp swimming fat and noble egos fed, peasants had to wrestle with mud year after year. For them, ponds were less about prestige and more about endless, back-breaking chores. You stand on the embankment, listening to the gurgle of sluices and the slap of nets. The scene is oddly hypnotic, a mixture of water, mud, sweat, and quiet determination. The carp, oblivious, circles slowly beneath, waiting for the next cycle of human hands to shape their world. You walk along a narrow lane toward the looming silhouette of a cathedral, its bells tolling across the valley. Inside, the clergy gather for a feast. Not a coronation, not a wedding, but simply a holy day that requires celebration. On long trestle tables lie loaves of bread, jugs of ale, and most prominently, shining platters of carp. You realize quickly that for bishops and abbots, fish weren't just food. They were statement of divine authority served with salt and vinegar. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Ecclesiastical households were some of the largest consumers of carp in the Middle Ages. Monasteries bred them, yes, but bishops also demanded lavish fish dishes at their tables. Surviving records show competition between church leaders. One bishop might boast of serving carp weighing over 15 pounds, while another claimed his pond produced fish fit for kings. And the quirky tidbit? Clerics sometimes exaggerated the size of their carp to such an extent that chroniclers described them in near mythical terms. One 13th century account insisted that a certain carp was as long as a child and as fat as a goose. Was it truth or holy bragging rights? Hard to say, but you can imagine monks snickering behind their sleeves. The feast itself is rich in sensory detail. Candles smoke overhead, wax dripping onto embroidered cloths. The air hums with Latin hymns sung earlier in the day, now replaced by clinking goblets. A bishop sits proudly, spearing chunks of carp, distributing portions with ceremonial gravity. The fish is dressed with almond sauce, spiced with ginger, and perhaps dotted with raisins. Everyone nods approvingly. This isn't just nourishment. It's theology you can chew. Historians still argue whether such displays were meant primarily to reinforce piety or to mimic noble banquets. Did bishops serve carp to glorify God through abundance, or show their worldly peers that the church could host as magnificently as any secular lord? Likely both. Joke number 1. Picture a bishop trying to bless the meal, only for a carp to leap dramatically from a nearby barrel, splashing holy water onto the assembled clergy. Divine timing or fishy protest. Joke number 2. Servants carrying platters slip on the flagstones, sending a golden glazed carp sliding the length of the hall like an oily hockey puck. Nobles try not to laugh, but chuckles ripple anyway. Joke number 3. Imagine two abbots bragging. My carp could feed 30 men. The other retorts, mine could swallow 30 men. At some point, the fish story sounds suspiciously like fishing tales of pub. You sit at the table in your mind's eye, chewing slowly. The fish is firm, the sauce fragrant, the candlelight lulling. Yet beneath the ritual lies a subtle competition. Bigger carp meant bigger prestige, and for church leaders, prestige equal authority. A pond wasn't just about feeding monks anymore. It was about feeding ambition. So, as you push back on the table, the air heavy with incense and fish, you realize that carp ponds fueled not just bellies but egos. In the church's hands, a fish became both supper and sermon, a symbol of piety, power, and pride, swimming together in the same bowl. You step back outside into the cool evening air, and now your attention drifts toward the kitchens, where the real alchemy of carp took place. Fires glow, spits turn, cauldrons bubble. The cooks are sweating, chopping, pounding spices in mortar and pestle. Here, among the chaos of pots and pans, carp becomes not just a fish, but a canvas. The mainstream historical fact. Medieval cookbooks, especially from the 14th and 15th centuries, contain numerous carp recipes. In German, French, and Czech manuscripts, carp is stewed in wine, roasted whole, or boiled with almonds. The variety shows just how central this fish had become to elite dining. In fact, one recipe suggests frying carp in oil, then simmering it in vinegar, ginger, and saffron, a dish as costly as it was time-consuming. The quirky tidbit? Some cooks recommended stuffing carp with raisins and prunes before roasting it. Sweet fruit in a savory fish was a medieval equivalent of pineapple on pizza, controversial, bold, and definitely conversation-worthy at the table. Imagine biting into carp only to find a plum rolling onto your tongue. Guests probably nodded gravely while privately thinking, "This is unusual." You lean close to the cauldron, smelling the spice blend, pepper biting your nose, saffron lending its golden hue, cinnamon adding warmth. The cooks mutter as they taste and adjust, knowing their lord expects perfection. In this age, food isn't just fuel, it's theater, a story told on the tongue. Carp provided a blank stage large enough to bear the weight of such expensive seasonings. Historians still argue whether medieval diners actually enjoyed the natural flavor of fish or whether it was drowned entirely in spices. Was carp chosen for taste, or simply for its size and ability to carry expensive imports that screamed wealth? Either way, each recipe was performance, balancing tradition, experiment, and ostentation. Joke number 1. Picture a cook so heavy-handed with ginger that guests sneeze in unison, mistaking dinner for a medieval allergy test. Joke number 2. Another cook proudly unveils a carp dish shaped into a dragon, complete with almond scales. The fish collapses halfway to the table, leaving the illusion closer to a muddy lizard. Joke number 3. A monk-turned-cook complains, "If I see one more raisin shoved into a fish belly, I'll take vows of silence forever." His fellow cooks laugh, wiping sweat and spiced dust from their brows. The clamor of the kitchen swirls around you. Knives clanking, water hissing on hot iron, voices rising in irritation and pride. It's a place of invention, where carp recipes travel by word of mouth and manuscript, growing ever more elaborate. You realize each dish wasn't only meant to feed, it was meant to astonish, to remind guests of the household's wealth and refinement. As you drift towards sleep, you picture a golden carp, glistening with saffron glaze, placed ceremoniously before noble diners. Behind it stands a hidden army of cooks, tired and spice-stained, who transform muddy pond fish into edible splendor. The carp swims again, this time across the palate, carrying with it the weight of kitchens, manuscripts, and a medieval obsession with taste as prestige. You step away from the smoky kitchens and find yourself beside a wagon loaded with barrels. The wheels creak, horses snort, and servants grunt as they lift sloshing containers onto the cart. Each barrel is half filled with water, moss, and sometimes wet cloth, and inside, yes, carp wriggle very much alive, enduring the jolting journey. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Carp were among the few freshwater fish transported long distances in the Middle Ages. Their resilience made them ideal for trade. Merchants carted them from monastic ponds in Bohemia or Bavaria to urban markets in Prague, Vienna, and beyond. By the 15th century, trade networks for live carp spanned much of Central Europe. The quirky tidbit? To keep carp alive, traders sometimes added bundles of fresh grass or moss into the barrels. This gave the fish oxygen as they wriggled and kept them calmer on the road. Imagine bumping along a muddy track for days, only to peek into the barrel and see whiskered faces staring back, unimpressed. You watch the team move down the rutted path. Every jolt makes the barrels slosh, water dripping from their seams. The drivers mutter, worried. If fish die en route, the profit dies with them. In cities, live carp fetched high prices, particularly before big religious festivals, when fish was in greatest demand. Historians still argue whether these networks were dominated by monasteries protecting their fish monopoly or by independent traders who undercut clerics in bustling markets. Joke number 1. Picture a barrel lid rattling open and a carp leaping free mid-journey, slapping into the mud. The driver groans, climbs down, and ends up chasing a fish across a puddle road while his horse looks on with horsey disdain. Joke number 2. Merchants traveling together complain of the smell. After a few days, the wagon smells less like luxury fish and more like swamp in a barrel. You imagine one muttering, "If wealth smells like this, I'll stay poor." Joke number 3. Carp, when stressed, sometimes make odd sucking sounds. Picture a medieval traveler trying to sleep near the wagon, only to be kept awake all night by a chorus of slurps and gurgles echoing from the barrels. But beyond the comedy, the system worked. The ability to move live fish meant carp weren't confined to estates where they were bred. They became symbols not just of local prestige, but of regional trade, linking monasteries, manors, and markets in a slippery economic chain. Carp barrels rolling along muddy roads were the arteries of medieval food supply, carrying status as surely as they carried scales. You close your eyes and hear it. The creak of wheels, the rhythmic clop of hooves, the faint sloshing inside wooden barrels. A procession of carp traveling through history, alive until the very last stop, where they would leap from muddy water into glitter of noble banquets. The road leads you to a small hamlet where tension hangs heavier than wood smoke. A stream trickles nearby, but its waters no longer flow naturally. Wooden channels divert it toward the Lord's pond, leaving villagers downstream with muddy trickles for their fields. You sense the frustration. Water is life, and water diverted for carp means less for wheat, barley, or even drinking. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Disputes over water rights in the Middle Ages were common, especially when it came to fish ponds. Lords and monasteries often claimed streams to fill their ponds, and peasants or rival landowners fought back with complaints, petitions, and sometimes outright sabotage. Legal records from across Europe preserve bitter quarrels over who may channel which brook and for how long. The quirky tidbit? Some quarrels grew so ridiculous that officials had to measure water with wooden sticks, judging how much flowed into fields versus ponds. Imagine two sides arguing over trickles, while a bored clerk scratches notches on a stick like he's refereeing the world's slowest race. You picture the conflict playing out. On one side, a lord insists, "My carp require fresh water to grow fat." On the other, villagers mutter, "Our children require fresh water to live." It's not an even contest. The Lord's men control the sluices, while peasants risk punishment if caught tampering. Still, some brave or desperate souls sneak out at night to smash barriers or reroute flow. In morning light, tempers flare. Historians still argue whether these disputes were primarily about survival or about symbolism. Was stealing back water away a challenging feudal power itself? Joke number 1. Imagine a pompous noble demanding half the stream for his pond. When asked how to measure half a stream, the clerk deadpans. Perhaps cut it lengthwise. Joke number 2. A farmer complains so loudly about water theft that he's fined in carp. You can almost hear him muttering, "I didn't want your fish stew. I wanted irrigation." Joke number 3. Villagers sneak to break a sluice at night, only to release the water directly into their neighbor's outhouse. Suddenly, the enemy isn't the Lord, but poor, unlucky Jacob next door. The soundscape is alive with frustration. The splash of diverted water, the rumble of raised voices, the creak of wooden gates. You stand at the center, feeling the tug-of-war between pond and plow, prestige and survival. In the end, disputes are written into charters, carved into laws, and whispered in taverns. Water is both invisible and vital, and as you watch, the carp glide in their fattening pond, utterly unaware that entire communities quarrel, curse, and sometimes fight over the very streams that sustain them. The pond gleams under the sun, a mirror of power, while fields nearby crack and thirst. For the villagers, carp ponds are not just symbols of wealth. They're symbols of imbalance, of water bending toward prestige instead of necessity. You walk on, the trickling stream behind you sounding almost like laughter or maybe like complaint, depending on how you listen. You return once more to the abbey grounds, where a monk stands on the bank, gazing into the pond as though it were a mirror. His hands are folded, his lips moving in prayer, but his eyes trace the slow circles of carp beneath the surface. To him, these fish are more than food. They are symbols. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In medieval sermons and devotional texts, carp occasionally appeared as metaphors for Christian virtues. Their patience, their habit of swimming in groups, and their silent endurance beneath murky waters made them handy symbols for humility and faith. Some clerics even compared carp to monks themselves, living quietly, hidden from the world, yet nourishing the spirit. Now for quirky tidbit. One manuscript suggests that carp, because they sometimes surface slowly to feed, reminded preachers of souls rising toward grace. That might feel like a stretch to you, but in a world hungry for metaphors, even whiskered fish serve as theological teaching aids. Imagine a novice being told, "Be like the carp, steady, silent, uncomplaining." The poor boy probably thought, "But father, carp eat mud." You stand by the pond and hear the gentle ripple as the fish surface. A monk leans down and drops crumbs into the water. The fish gather, patient and calm, their whiskers brushing against one another. To the monk, this is a holy image of community. Historians still argue whether such symbolism truly influenced daily devotion, or whether it was more rhetorical flourish than lived belief. Was carp really a moral example, or just a convenient sermon prop? Joke number 1. Imagine a monk lecturing, "Brethren, be as humble as carp." A novice whispers, "Does that mean we should suck mud too?" Cue muffled giggles. Joke number 2. A preacher gets carried away and declares carp to be angels of the pond. A listener mutters, "Then why do angels taste so good with vinegar?" Joke number 3. One scribe doodles a fish in the margin of his manuscript, giving it a halo. The drawing looks more like a catfish wearing a crown, but the intent is clear. As the afternoon sun warms the cloister walls, the pond glimmers like stained glass in motion. The fish drift, quiet, unhurried, embodying the virtues the monks hope to see in themselves. Whether or not the carp truly deserve such symbolism, they became part of the monastic imagination. Patient companions, silent teachers, edible sermons swimming in muddy water. You walk on, the monks chant fading behind you. The pond remains a place where theology and appetite blur, where fish carry both nourishment and metaphor in their scales. You wander into the courtyard of a noble palace, where the day's air feels festive. Trumpets sound at the gate, servants hustle about, and in the middle of the commotion is a curious sight. A wooden tub carried by 4 men, sloshing with water. Inside, a massive carp twists and glimmers, alive and heavy, its scales catching the sun like wet armor. Here's the mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, especially by the 15th century, live carp were sometimes presented as gifts between rulers, nobles, and church leaders. A carp wasn't just a fish. It was a demonstration of wealth, hospitality, and power, wrapped up in slippery silver skin. Delivering a live carp to a friend or ally was like sending a bottle of vintage wine today. Except this bottle stared back at you. And the quirky tidbit? Chroniclers describe carp arriving in elaborate containers, sometimes lined with herbs to freshen the water, sometimes perfumed with rosemary to disguise the smell. Imagine opening a crate expecting treasure, only to find a fat, whiskered fish staring with all the gravitas of a bored diplomat. The scene unfolds. A visiting dignitary accepts the tub, peers in, and nods solemnly, as though receiving a relic. Courtiers clap politely. Later, in private, the dignitary probably sighs, "Great, now we have to feed this thing until dinner." Historians still argue whether such carp gifts were genuinely valued for their taste or primarily as symbolic gestures of goodwill and alliance. Joke number 1. Picture a clumsy servant tripping, sending the precious gift carp flopping across the flagstones while horrified nobles chase in circles. Joke number 2. Imagine the awkwardness of gifting carp to someone who actually disliked fish. You can almost hear the forced gratitude. "Ah, yes, exactly what I hoped for, a very wet present." Joke number 3. Think of the sheer absurdity of prestige measured in gallons of pond water. You half expect nobles to one-up each other. My carp was delivered in rose water. Mine arrived in a golden bucket. The ceremony of fish gifting feels both pompous and faintly comical. Yet in this world, where every symbol carried weight, a carp was not just dinner. It was a messenger. It said, "I have abundance, and I choose to share it with you." It swam across political alliances, feasts, and rivalries, its whiskered face silently binding friendships and obligations. As the nobles disperse and servants carry the carp off toward the kitchens, you remain in the courtyard, smiling at the memory of fish as diplomacy. The pond, once a muddy rectangle in a field, now echoes in the clatter of courtly politics, transformed into a shimmering, living gift. You drift toward the manor's kitchen wing again, though this time your attention turns not to the cooks but to the women of the household, bustling in and out with baskets and ledgers. Noble ladies were often responsible for overseeing domestic supplies, and that included the ponds. You picture a lady in a velvet gown, lifting her skirts as she steps carefully along the embankment, pointing with a slender hand as servants scatter scraps of the carp. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Noble women in medieval Europe frequently managed the provisioning of their households. While men concerned themselves with politics and hunting, women oversaw pantries, storerooms, gardens, and yes, fish ponds. A lady who kept her ponds well stocked in her kitchen supplied earned a reputation for competence. In some estates, her stewardship directly affected the family's prestige at feasts. Now for the quirky tidbit. There are scattered records of noble women ordering the draining of ponds themselves, standing on the bank with a tally sheet, counting fish as they flopped into baskets. One chronicler described a duchess who insisted on checking each carp by hand, which sounds suspiciously like micromanagement in muddy boots. Imagine her jeweled rings coated in slime, while peasants tried not to laugh. The rhythm of their work is clear. Women not only supervised, but also decided how fish were distributed, what went to the Lord's table, what was preserved in vinegar, and on rare occasions, what might be gifted to retainers or the church. Historians still argue whether this authority was genuine managerial power or simply an extension of household duty. Were these women exercising economic agency, or were they confined to glorified bookkeeping roles? Joke number 1. Picture a noble lady scolding a servant for undefeating carp, only to trip on the embankment and tumble gracefully, but mud splattered, into the pond. Joke number 2. Imagine her instructing the cook to prepare carp with prunes, then tasting the result and whispering, "Perhaps fewer prunes next time," as everyone nods furiously in agreement. Joke number 3. Carp weren't always cooperative. Picture a lady leaning in too close, only for a giant fish to leap and splash her square in the face. Prestige washed away in a single gulp of muddy water. Yet beneath the humor lies real influence. These women made decisions that shaped the household's reputation. A well-run pond meant fish ready for feast days and guests. A poorly managed pond risked embarrassment and whispers that the household couldn't maintain order. You watch as the lady walks back toward the manor, her gown trailing damp grass, her servants balancing baskets of carp. She glances once more at the water, satisfied. In the glimmer of the pond, you see reflected not only fish but also the quiet authority of women, shaping prestige from beneath the ripples. You follow the trail of damp footprints into a quiet scriptorium, where a monk bends over parchment, scratching in steady rhythm. By candlelight, he isn't illuminating scripture tonight, but jotting down an odd little note, a record of the abbey's carp harvest. 32 taken, 15 returned, one of miraculous size. The Latin reads, neat and solemn. Carp are not only food, they become lines and chronicles, details woven into the written memory of the age. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval chronicles and annals occasionally mention fish ponds and carp, especially when unusual catches occurred. Monasteries prided themselves on keeping orderly records, and sometimes the appearance of an especially large or oddly colored carp was deemed noteworthy enough to be preserved in ink. These entries weren't daily trivia. They were small moments where nature and history blurred. The quirky tidbit? Some chroniclers describe carp as though they were touched by divine favor. One entry claims a carp surface during Easter Mass, a sign of blessing. Another tells of fish leaping, as though applauding a saint's sermon. Whether these were embellishments or honest marvels, the idea that carp might carry spiritual messages is both endearing and faintly absurd. You lean closer to the manuscript. The monk doodles a fish in the margin, its whiskers exaggerated into curly spirals. He pauses, smiles, and continues writing. In his tired imagination, perhaps the carp swimming in the abbey pond are part of a grander story, one worth setting down alongside kings and battles. Historians still argue whether such mentions reveal genuine reverence for fish, or whether monks were simply filling pages with local color when nothing else happened that year. Joke number 1. Picture a chronicler proudly recording a miraculous carp, only for another monk to mutter, "That's just Brother Thomas's dinner that got away." Joke number 2. Imagine centuries later, a historian pores over manuscript, puzzled by the phrase "fish applauded." He squints and wonders if it was a scribal error for "fish splashed." Joke number 3. Scribes often got bored. You can almost see one drawing a fish wearing a bishop's mitre, chuckling softly before erasing it in guilty haste. The scriptorium is hushed except for the scratch of quills and the faint drip of wax. Outside, the pond gleams in the moonlight, each ripple a story waiting to be told. Inside, the fish become history, not grand, not heroic, but curious, patient, and oddly immortal in ink. You close your eyes, hearing the soft rustle of parchment, the bubbling of distant water, and the faint hum of a monk's chant. Carp, humble creatures of mud, now live forever in words, their lives preserved in the margins of history, like silver scales glinting just below the surface. You step away from the scriptorium and out into the night air, where the pond lies under a moonlit sheen. The water is alive not only with carp, but with an entire little ecosystem that rarely makes it into chronicles. Frogs croak in ragged chorus, dragonflies skim across the surface, and a heron stands statuesque in the reeds, waiting for an opportunity. The pond is not an isolated larder. It's a stage bustling with creatures who don't care a whit about prestige. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medieval fish ponds supported a wide variety of life beyond their intended stock. Archaeological digs at former pond sites reveal bones of frogs, turtles, birds, and even occasional mammals that wandered too close. While carp are the focus, the ponds inevitably created miniature wetlands that altered the landscape and attracted wildlife. And the quirky tidbit? Poachers sometimes took advantage of this. Under cover of darkness, villagers would sneak in, not always for carp, but for frogs or birds nesting at the edges. A stolen frog leg supper might be less risky than trying to haul away a fat carp. Some lords even set guards at their ponds, not just to protect fish, but to scare off sneaky frog hunters. Imagine a peasant caught red-handed with a bulging sack that croaks at exactly the wrong moment. You kneel by the water's edge, listening. The heron takes flight suddenly, wings beating the air like soft drums. The carp scatter below with lazy swirls. Poachers might have called this music opportunity, while nobles called it theft. Historians still argue whether pond poaching was truly rampant or whether it exaggerated in records written by disgruntled landlords. Joke number 1. A poacher tiptoes to the bank, net ready, only to slip and land flat in the mud. The carp ignore him entirely, but his lantern sputters out, leaving him soaked and grumpy. Joke number 2. A lord brags that he has guards posted at his ponds. One guest whispers, "To protect the carp?" Another replies, "No, to protect the frogs from the peasants." Joke number 3. Frogs themselves, croaking endlessly, probably ruin the sleep of noble households. Imagine a lord lying awake, muttering, "I built ponds for fish, not for frog choirs." The night air grows heavier, scented with damp earth and algae. You hear the faint ripple of fish, the croak of frogs, the rustle of reeds. All of it is both nuisance and charm, wealth and wildlife intertwined. The carp swim quietly beneath, while life around them thrives in shadow. For a moment, you realize that prestige comes with unintended consequences. A pond meant carp for feasts, but also meant frog choruses, heron raids, and sneaky poachers. You drift off of the sounds of this nocturnal orchestra, the pond alive with voices both celebrated and ignored. You wake to the chill of dawn and notice a commotion at the far end of the pond. Villagers have gathered, not to admire the fish, but to watch justice being served. 2 men, accused of sneaking carp under cover of night, are being punished in a way both theatrical and humiliating, forced to wade waist-deep in the icy pond while holding stones above their heads. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medieval courts often handed out peculiar punishments tied to the crime itself. For fish theft, that sometimes meant being dunked, paraded, or otherwise humiliated in water. In manorial roles, Records survive if thieves find heavily, or, if too poor, subjected to physical penance right at the pond they plundered. And the quirky tidbit? Some punishments involve making the culprit stand in the pond barefoot through winter mornings, supposedly to let him feel the suffering of the fish. It was part practical deterrent, part public spectacle, and entirely miserable. Imagine your legs going numb while onlookers chuckle. The crowd shifts uneasily, half sympathetic, half entertained. Children giggle as one thief loses his balance and splashes down with a dramatic grunt, soaking himself head to toe. The Lord's bailiff scowls, scribbles notes, and pretends this chaos is solemn law. Historians still argue whether such punishments were effective deterrents or just cheap theater meant to reinforce authority. Joke number 1. Picture the thief shivering, muttering through chattering teeth, "I only wanted soup, not a swim." Joke number 2. A bystander shouts, "Catch a carp while you're down there," earning laughs until the bailiff silences him. Joke number 3. Another villager whispers, "If we all get punished with pond baths, perhaps we can skip church bathing this year." The scene is stark but revealing. Carp theft wasn't trivial. It touched the heart of wealth and prestige. To steal a carp was to challenge the Lord's authority, to dip into the very symbol of his household abundance. So punishments had to sting, not just in body but in dignity. You shiver in sympathy as the men stumble out, dripping, lips blue, clothes heavy with mud. The carp beneath continue to swim lazily, indifferent to the drama above. The pond is both pantry and prison, stage and punishment ground. And as the crowd disperses, muttering about justice and hunger, the lesson lingers. Fish can feed, but they can also condemn. The morning mist clings low over the water, and now the pond shifts in your imagination from courtroom to apothecary. A villager approaches the edge with a small clay jar, muttering prayers as he dips a net to snatch a single carp. This one won't end up roasted with saffron or stewed with ginger. It's destined for medicine, or at least what passed for medicine in the Middle Ages. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medieval medical texts occasionally prescribed fish parts, including carp for ailments. Carp gallbladders, ground into paste, were believed to cure eye problems. Scales were sometimes dried and powdered, added to potions for fevers or kidney stones. A pond was thus not only a pantry but a pharmacy, its whiskered residents considered both food and cure. And the quirky tidbit? Some healers swore by carp slime. Yes, the goo on their skin, applied to wounds. It was thought to draw out infection. Imagine lying in bed while someone smears carp goo across your cut, assuring you that healing is on the way. Comforting? Perhaps not. Sticky? Definitely. You watch as the healer returns to his cottage. Carp scales spread on a cloth to dry by the fire. The smell is pungent, and children wrinkle their noses. The patient groans, unsure whether relief or nausea will come first. Historians still argue whether these practices had any genuine medicinal effect or whether carp-based remedies were more placebo than cure. Was it proto-science or just another fishy superstition? Joke number 1. A patient grumbles, "I came for healing, not seasoning," as the healer sprinkles powdered scales into a bitter brew. Joke number 2. A woman with a headache is told to press a carp bladder to her forehead. She deadpans. "At least now I look as miserable as I feel." Joke number 3. Picture a monk copying medical texts, sighing, "Carp slime for wounds? I'll stick to honey, thanks." Yet for all the strangeness, carp remedies had a logic rooted in the era. If fish sustained the body, perhaps they could heal it too. And in communities where options were few, people clung to whatever hope swam before them. You lean back, the image lingering. Jars of powdered scales, bowls of murky tonics, patients sipping grimly. The pond, once again, proves itself versatile. Feeding feasts, settling disputes, and now, providing cures that waver between hope and absurdity. Beneath the surface, the carp glide on, unaware they become both supper and salve, symbols of nourishment and medicine wrapped in silver skin. You leave the smoky cottage with jars of dubious remedies and follow a dirt road scarred by wagon ruts. The path leads you toward the edge of battlefield, or rather, its aftermath. The air is heavy with the smell of trampled grass and distant smoke. Soldiers, weary and hungry after marching, stumble toward the nearest source of food, the Lord's carp pond. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Armies on campaign often raided local resources, not just grain and livestock, but also fish ponds. Chronicles from 100 Years' War mention troops emptying entire ponds to feed themselves. For soldiers, carp weren't symbols of prestige. They were calories, quick and plentiful if you had nets, or more often, just willing hands. And the quirky tidbit? Some accounts describe soldiers wading into ponds fully armored, convinced their gear would scare the fish into submission. Instead, the carp darted away, and the men ended up looking like flailing tin scarecrows. Later, they stripped the tunics, scooping fish with bare hands, slipping, cursing, and laughing in the mud while their captains pretended it was all part strategy. You picture the scene. Knights sitting on overturned barrels, chewing roasted carp hastily skewered over campfires. The fish are bony, charred, and eaten with greasy fingers, but hunger makes it taste like victory. Soldiers pass around flasks of ale, telling jokes, their laughter rising above the croaking of displaced frogs. Historians still argue whether carp raids were tolerated as necessary spoils of war or condemned as theft from civilians who could ill afford the loss. Joke number 1. A soldier bites into undercooked carp, spits out a bone, and mutters, "This fish is more dangerous than enemy." Joke number 2. Another swears the carp in one pond were so slippery they fought back, sending him tumbling face first into muck. His comrades crown him defeated by dinner. Joke number 3. A captain inspects his men's catch, sighs, and says, "I asked for discipline, not a fish market." The men cheer anyway, holding up their wriggling prizes. The carp pond becomes a battlefield of its own, stripped in hours by men who care nothing for its prestige. For lords, it's a loss. For soldiers, a godsend. You imagine the aftermath. Broken sluices, churned mud, empty water, and villagers left staring at vanished wealth. The carp, once symbols of abundance, are reduced to charred suppers in the hands of hungry armies. As the soldiers march on, the pond lies ruined, reeds flattened, frogs scattered. Yet within a season, life will creep back, and the cycle will begin again. Still, you can't help but smile at the image. Carp ponds feeding both kings at banquets and ragged soldiers in muddy camps, swimming silently between luxury and survival. You wander away from the trampled pond, the sounds of soldiers fading, and find yourself in the study of a philosopher, his table cluttered with scrolls, quills, and a half-finished goblet of wine. He's not writing about kings or wars. He's pondering fish. Carp, specifically. He strokes his beard and muses aloud. Do these creatures live unnaturally long? Could some be immortal beneath the water? Here's the mainstream historical fact. Naturalists of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, such as Albertus Magnus, wrote at length about fish, including carp. They observed their habits, lifespans, and diets, blending keen observation with fanciful speculation. Carp's longevity impressed many, with tales of specimens living for decades, or even centuries, fueling debate about whether they might defy ordinary limits. And the quirky tidbit? A 16th century story tells of carp, supposedly marked with a ring by a bishop, and later found alive more than 200 years afterward. Modern historians dismiss this as legend, but at the time, people whispered it as proof of fishy immortality. Imagine gossip swirling. The bishop's carp outlived the bishop himself. The philosopher scratches notes. Do fish sleep? Do they dream? Do they feel time as we do? His apprentice, half bored, doodles carp in the margins, giving them halos and wings. Historians still argue whether these philosophical debates influenced real husbandry practices or whether they were simply academic distractions, minds swimming in metaphor more than mud. Joke number 1. Picture the philosopher presenting his carp longevity theory at a symposium, only for another scholar to quip, "Yes, but how do we ask the fish its age?" Joke number 2. His apprentice, tired of carp talk, sneaks a roasted one onto the table. "Look, master, this one's immortal too, until lunch." Joke number 3. The scholar insists carp might hold secrets of eternity. A servant mutters, "If eternity smells like pond water, I'll pass." The candle gutters, casting shadows across the parchment. The philosopher leans over his notes, lost in thought, convinced that carp hide mysteries worth pondering. For him, The pond is not just a pantry, but a mirror of eternity, a watery stage where the questions of life and death play out slowly. You drift away from a study, the quills still scratching, the whispers of fishy immortality echoing. Carp swim silently below, unconcerned with debates, yet inspiring centuries of wonder, skepticism, and sleepy musings. You leave behind the philosopher's cluttered desk and step into grounds of a later estate, centuries after those first muddy ponds. The carp are still there, but now their watery homes are framed by carefully raked gravel paths, trimmed hedges, and pavilions designed for leisure strolls. The ponds have evolved into something more refined, echoing across time in the layout of formal gardens. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Renaissance and early modern landscapes borrowed heavily from medieval fish pond systems. The geometric ponds, dikes, and water channels originally built for carp inspired the ornamental lakes and canals of later pleasure gardens, from Italian villas to French chateaux. What started as a food supply became a blueprint for leisure architecture. And the quirky tidbit? Some estates even kept carp in ornamental pools long after they stopped eating them, simply because they looked elegant. Visitors admired the fish gliding under stone bridges, treating them less as dinner and more as moving decoration. Imagine nobles strolling with lace collars fluttering, peering down at carp as though viewing living jewels. The soundscape changes. No longer the grunts of peasants dragging muck, but the crunch of shoes on gravel, the rustle of silk gowns, and polite conversation echoing across marble balustrades. A lady gestures gracefully to the pond and sighs. How tranquil. Forgetting the fish once symbolized muddy labor and endless Lent dinners. Historians still argue whether this shift from practical ponds to ornamental waterworks marked progress in aesthetics or simply another way for elites to disguise practicality as beauty. Joke number 1. Picture a Renaissance noble bragging about his elegant fish pond, only for a carp to leap and splash muddy water across his ruffled collar. Instant fashion disaster. Joke number 2. Guests admire the tranquil design until someone notices servants still hauling buckets of muck from pond. Suddenly, tranquility smells suspiciously like fertilizer. Joke number 3. Carp, oblivious, continue their lazy circles. You can almost hear them muttering. Once we were dinner, now we're decoration. Same pond, different day. As you stroll the pathways, the transformation feels seamless. Medieval engineering has become Renaissance elegance. Muddy dikes reshaped into artful symmetry. The carp swim beneath, linking eras together in silent continuity. From feast to metaphor, from symbol to scenery, the fish pond becomes not just a pantry or a stage, but a model for human ambition to shape land, water, and beauty itself. You pause by a pavilion, watching the fish ripple under arch reflections. What began as sustenance has turned into spectacle, and in their silent swimming, the carp carries centuries of human vanity, disguised as art. The path curves from formal gardens into a town square alive with the sound of pipes and drums. Banners flutter, stalls line the streets, and the air is thick with the scent of roasting meat and spilled ale. At the heart of the celebration stands a long table, stacked with baskets of flopping carp, just pulled from nearby ponds. It's autumn, and the carp harvest has become not only household work, but community festival. Here's the mainstream historical fact. In parts of Central Europe, especially Bohemia and Moravia, carp harvests were communal events. By the late Middle Ages, these autumnal gatherings became woven into local culture, marking the shift of seasons and filling larders before winter. Even today, echoes remain in the Czech tradition of eating carp at Christmas. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some towns turn harvest into outright spectacle, staging pageants where men dressed as king carp paraded through the streets. Picture someone in a scaled costume, whiskers dangling, trailed by children singing songs about fish. It's half carnival, half grocery trip, with a slippery mascot wobbling along cobblestones. You hear the crowd cheer as the first nets are emptied into wooden troughs. Children squeal, splashing water as carp flop violently. Vendors shout over the din, fresh from the pond, fat and holy. Musicians play, their fiddles and drums punctuating the chaos. Historians still argue whether these festivals were primarily economic, meant to distribute fish efficiently, or symbolic, reinforcing bond to community through shared abundance. Joke number 1. A boy proudly clutches a carp almost as big as he is, only for it to wriggle free and smack him in the face. He laughs, soaked, while the crowd roars approval. Joke number 2. A town drunk declares he'll wrestle the fattest carp in the trough. He dives in, flails, and emerges empty-handed, his hat floating away while children howl with glee. Joke number 3. Carp stalls stand next to beer cellars, and before long, someone is dunking fried fish into their ale, insisting it's a new recipe. Spoiler, it isn't. The day stretches with laughter, bargaining, music, and feasting. The carp harvest is hard work, hauling, sorting, cleaning, but in festival form, it becomes joy. Families bring home their fish, the ponds are reset, and the community feels tied together by muddy water and silver scales. As the sun sets, torches flare, and you watch King Carp parade one last time, his costume shimmering in firelight. The pond may belong to lords or monasteries, but for a few days each year, it belongs to the people, a stage where carp leap into folklore, festivity, and memory. The festival fade behind you, and your path winds into quieter countryside, where you stumble upon a small, forgotten pond half hidden by reeds. The water is murky, yet when the sun strikes just right, you notice flashes of unusual color. Not the dull silver gray of ordinary carp, but patches of gold, orange, even speckled black and white. You lean closer, realizing that medieval ponds once held more variety than we usually imagine. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Carp were selectively bred in medieval Europe, producing strains with subtle differences in size, shape, and even color. Some noble households prided themselves on unusual-looking fish, treating them as curiosities to show off during feasts. This early tinkering with breeding foreshadowed later traditions that gave rise to ornamental koi. And the quirky tidbit? Chronicles mention oddly shaped carp, short-bodied, humped, or spotted, being prized as rarities. Instead of discarding them, nobles sometimes paraded them to guests as marvels. Imagine a servant carrying a lopsided carp into hall, while the lord proudly declared, "Behold, nature's joke and my treasure." You squat near the water's edge, watching one golden fish drift lazily. Children might press their faces close, giggling at its strange shape. For peasants, such sights were reminders that ponds held not only wealth, but wonder. Historians still argue whether these early breeding experiments were intentional attempts at variety or simply happy accidents embraced for prestige. Joke number 1. Imagine a lord bragging about his rare golden carp, only for a guest to mutter, "It looks more like a gilded potato." Joke number 2. Picture a cook grumbling as he tries to prepare a hunchback fish that won't sit properly on the platter, sliding off like a stubborn loaf. Joke number 3. Children, mischievous, might have made up nicknames: crooked carp, fat carp, spotty carp, teasing the fish as though they were characters in a pondside play. You lean back on the grass, staring at the odd ripples. In these overlooked ponds, medieval experimentation quietly unfolded, blending necessity with amusement. Variety meant status. While common folk ate whatever fish they could catch, nobles displayed their eccentric breeds, much like rare roses or falcons. The golden carp flicks its tail and disappears into shadow. For a moment, you sense the centuries stretching forward toward koi ponds and ornamental fish bowls, all born from these muddy medieval waters. Prestige wasn't only about size or abundance. It could also be about rarity, strangeness, or beauty shimmering just beneath the surface. You leave behind a sleepy pond with its speckled curiosities and step into a village struck by a darker mood. The air is heavy, doors are shut, and silence lingers except for the toll of a bell. The plague has reached this place, reshaping not only daily life, but also what people dare to eat. In fearful times, carp ponds suddenly seem less like luxuries and more like lifelines. Here's the mainstream historical fact. During outbreaks of plague and other epidemics, fish, especially freshwater carp, were often considered safer than pork or beef. With livestock dying or suspected of spreading illness, ponds provided a controlled, enclosed source of protein. Records show fish consumption rose during crises, especially among those wealthy enough to access carp. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some communities believe carp flesh could actually protect against disease. Doctors recommended eating it lightly boiled with herbs of purification. In extreme cases, People even bathe in pond water infused with carp oil, convinced it cleansed the body. Imagine stepping into a tub of fish-scented broth and calling it medicine. You walk through the village and notice how the pond becomes both pantry and refuge. Peasants glance at it nervously, hoping their lord might allow fish to be distributed more freely in desperate times. In some places, charitable gifts of carp were made to the poor during outbreaks, though often not enough to match the need. Historians still argue whether carp genuinely reduced disease risk, or whether their supposed safety was simply wishful thinking in an era desperate for certainty. Joke number 1. A doctor prescribes boiled carp daily to ward off plague. A villager mutters, "If I must smell like a fish, perhaps death will avoid me." Joke number 2. A family bathes in carp-infused water, and the youngest child whispers, "At least the fleas will drown." Joke number 3. Someone insists carp stew cured his cough overnight. His skeptical neighbor replies, "Or maybe you just coughed it into the soup." The pond ripples quietly under the weight of fear and hope. For nobles, it's still prestige. For villagers, it becomes survival. Carp swim beneath the surface, unaware they've been recast as guardians against invisible enemies. You sit by the edge, breathing in damp, algae-scented air. The stillness feels heavier than usual, punctuated by distant coughs and the low moan of the bell. Yet in the midst of dread, the pond offers continuity. Its fish keep growing, its cycles persist, and for some, that persistence feels like reassurance. Life glides on, even in plague years, whiskered and silent in muddy waters. You rise from the somber village and wander into the echo of a noble's accounting chamber, where parchment scrolls are spread across a long oak table. The air smells of ink and wax, and the steward bends over his ledger, scratching steadily. Numbers flow across the page, not of gold or jewels, but of fish. Carp are tallied with the same gravity as taxes and rents. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Estate accounts from the late Middle Ages often recorded fish pond yields in meticulous detail. Ponds were not just features of prestige. They were assets measured, audited, and flaunted. Nobles used ledgers to boast about how many carp their ponds produced, equating volume of fish with volume of wealth. The quirky tidbit? Some lords exaggerated yield in their accounts, claiming ponds produced miraculous numbers of carp each season. It wasn't always fraud. Sometimes it was ego, sometimes creative math, sometimes a scribe too eager to flatter his employer. Imagine writing 100 carp, each fatter than the last, while knowing half were actually scrawny. You picture the steward reading aloud. This year, the western pond gave 60 fattened carp, the southern pond 32. The noble nods smugly, as though every fish were a coin clinking into his coffer. The more carp, the richer he appears, not just in food but in prestige. Historians still argue whether these records reflected actual abundance or were carefully curated propaganda to impress rivals. Joke number 1. A clerk falls asleep mid-tally and accidentally writes 600 instead of 60. The Lord beams. "Truly, my pond is blessed," while the peasants groan, knowing they'll be blamed when the numbers don't match reality. Joke number 2. A noble points proudly at his ledger and brags, "My pond yields more than my vineyards." His steward mutters under his breath, "Perhaps if we counted eels as carp, sire." Joke number 3. Servants overhear the count and joke that the carp themselves keep ledgers at the bottom of the pond, writing, "This year, we avoided nets 45 times." The room is hushed except for the scratch of quills and the occasional crackle of the hearth. Each number inscribed is less about fish on a table and more about status on paper. Carp become a currency of reputation, swimming from ponds into ink, from ink into memory. You step outside again, the pond gleaming faintly in the distance. It's easy to forget, looking at still water, that beneath lies not only food, but a bank account of sorts, tallied in scales and fins. The noble, proud of his ledger, sees every ripple as another entry in his book of power. You drift onward, leaving the steward's ink-stained ledger behind, and soon find yourself beside a campfire where weary travelers exchange stories. The smoke rises into the night as one merchant, just returned from a long journey east, begins boasting. He has tasted delicacies from distant lands, spiced lamb in Persia, rice dishes in India, salted fish in China, And now, back in Europe, he chuckles about the humble carp served at noble tables. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medieval travelers frequently compared European foods with those they encountered abroad. Carp, while esteemed in Europe, was often ranked against more exotic fare in Asia or the Middle East. Some merchants wrote admiringly of the variety of fish in Chinese rivers or the delicate preparation of Japanese seafood, remarking that European carp seemed plain by comparison. And the quirky tidbit? One traveler described European carp as mud-scented cousins when set against the brilliance of Eastern delicacies. Yet he also admitted they were valued precisely because they could survive long journeys in barrels, something many exotic fish could never do. Carp, it seemed, were sturdy if not glamorous, the dependable draft horses of the fish world. Around the fire, the travelers laugh, swapping exaggerated tales. One insists he ate a fish in India spiced so strongly it sang in my stomach for 3 days. Another boasts of tasting river crabs in china the size of dinner plates. The carp, circling in muddy European ponds, suddenly feels both humble and proud. Not exotic, not dazzling, but steady, reliable, and deeply woven into the culture of home. Historians still argue whether these comparisons diminished carp's reputation or enhanced it by placing it in conversation with global cuisines. Joke number 1, a merchant sneers, "Carp tastes like mud." His companion retorts, "Yes, but it's our mud." Joke number 2, another insists his carp stew is superior to any Eastern delicacy. The rest of the campfire groans, dubbing him Sir Carp Defender. Joke number 3. Someone claims to have seen a golden fish in Nile that outshone European carp. A listener replies, "Perhaps it was just sunlight on mud," and the circle bursts out laughing. The fire crackles, shadows flicker, and voices soften as the night deepens. Carp, mocked and praised in equal measure, becomes a symbol of Europe's culinary identity. Less glamorous than the East marvels, but cherished nonetheless. You listen as the last merchant sighs. Still, after all my travels, nothing feels quite like home, and nothing says home like a fat carp on the table. You smile in the dark. Carp ponds, for all their mud and musty smell, are woven so tightly into medieval Europe that even in tales of distant lands, their whiskered presence lingers. You leave the firelit circle of travelers and drift into a quieter corner of a manor where a minstrel tunes his lute by the pond. The evening is soft, the moon just lifting above the trees, and the musician plucks a gentle melody. His voice rises, weaving words not of knights or saints, but of water and fish. Carp, oddly enough, swim into poetry. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medieval troubadours and poets often used everyday images, birds, flowers, rivers, to craft metaphors for love and longing. While carp aren't the most common image, scattered verses survive that liken their steady swimming to patience and love, or their slippery bodies to elusive desire. In folk songs, fish often symbolize fidelity, abundance, or the restless heart. And a quirky tidbit? One anonymous poem compared ladies' eyes to the gleam of carp beneath clear water. It may not sound flattering now, but in its time, that shimmer of scales suggested hidden depth, mystery, and beauty glimpsed only briefly. Imagine serenading someone by saying, "Your gaze is like a pond full of carp." Risky but memorable. The minstrel sings, his voice carrying over the rippling water. A noble couple strolls nearby, pausing to listen. The lady giggles at the strange metaphor. The lord pretends to be moved but whispers, "Next time, sing about falcons." The minstrel shrugs and continues, his song turning the pond into a mirror of longing. Historians still argue whether such fishy metaphors were tongue-in-cheek or sincere attempts at lyrical depth. Joke number 1. Picture a poet reciting earnestly, "My love is like a carp." His friends cough, one mutters muddy, and the poet storms off in indignation. Joke number 2. A jester interrupts the song with his own rhyme. "A carp may slip, a carp may slide, but still it ends a-fried." The crowd laughs, the minstrel frowns. Joke number 3. A suitor presents a carp as a love token. The lady recoils. Flowers would have smelled better, yet the image persists. The pond at night, shimmering under moonlight, lends itself to metaphor. The carp glides slowly, unhurried, mysterious, as if embodying the hidden currents of emotion. For poets with few jewels at hand, Fish became stand-ins for desire, patience, and the strangeness of love. You sit quietly, hearing the last note fade, the ripples reflecting the moon. The carp swim on, unwitting muses, their silver scales turning mud and water into verses whispered for centuries. The moon fades into gray dawn, and suddenly rain begins to lash the countryside. You follow the stream downhill where swollen waters roar against fragile dikes. The carp pond you come to know so well shudders under the surge, its banks trembling, sluices groaning. Nature, indifferent to prestige, sometimes sweeps it all away in a single night. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Floods were a constant threat to medieval fish ponds. Heavy rains or snowmelt could burst embankments, sending carp tumbling into rivers and fields. Lords and monasteries recorded these disasters with dismay, noting lost harvests worth fortunes in prestige and food. Entire ponds would vanish, emptied by forces no ledger or prayer could restrain. And the quirky tidbit? Some chronicles tell of villagers chasing runaway carp through fields after floods, scooping them with baskets and even hats. For once, peasants enjoyed a feast of noble fish, nature's rebellion delivering prestige straight into their hands. Imagine the laughter as children sprint barefoot across muddy fields, clutching slippery prizes. The storm rages in your mind. Water gushes. Carp thrash wildly. Embankments crack. Servants scramble with shovels, shouting above the roar, while the noble himself wrings his hands uselessly. Historians still argue whether medieval ponds were truly fragile constructions or whether chroniclers exaggerated losses to highlight divine punishment. Was each burst bank an engineering failure, or a reminder that even wealth bows to weather? Joke number 1. Picture a pompous lord insisting his pond is indestructible moments before the embankment collapses and sends him sliding into the torrent like a startled duck. Joke number 2. Villagers tell tall tales of carp marching through the streets after floods as though fish had declared independence. Joke number 3. A peasant scoops up a wriggling carp, holds it aloft and shouts, "God provides," while his neighbor mutters, "and the Lord pays for new boots." The storm subsides. In its wake lie wrecked banks, stranded fish glinting in puddles, and broken sluices half buried in silt. The carp, once neatly enclosed in a symbol of prestige, scatter into the wild, some lost forever, some spawning new lives in distant streams. You stand in the silence after chaos. The pond lies scarred, half emptied, yet the land smells fresh, alive. Floods remind everyone, lords, peasants, monks, that nature writes its own ledger. Carp ponds may symbolize control, but in the end, they belong as much to storm and river as to human hands. You step into the manor's hall once more, where parchment rolls are stacked high, sealed with ribbons and wax. These aren't ordinary ledgers of grain or taxes. They are charters and contracts, legal documents that spell out who owns which pond, who controls which stream, and, astonishingly, who holds rights to fish not even born yet. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medieval legal documents sometimes specified all future fish when granting rights to ponds. These charters bound not only current carp, but generations yet to swim. To own a pond was to own its watery future, a curious blend of law and prophecy inked onto parchment. And the quirky tidbit? One bizarre contract reportedly granted monastery rights to every carp that may leap within this pond until Judgment Day. Imagine signing papers that cover eternity, just in case the fish survive the apocalypse. The hall buzzes with arguments. Lawyers in long robes debate clauses, clerks scribble, and nobles tap fingers impatiently. The wording grows absurdly specific. Carp of full length, carp of finger size, carp loss of herons not counted. Historians still argue whether these over-detailed charters reflect genuine legal practice, or just a medieval love of paperwork and precision taken to comical extremes. Joke number 1. A noble insists on his future carp rights. A rival snarks. What if they evolve legs? Well, you own them too. Joke number 2. A scribe bored writes, all fish, whether whiskered, spotted, or unusually fat, are included. Later, a reader wonders if that was official law, or a prank. Joke number 3. Imagine a peasant overhearing these lofty debates and muttering, if they're arguing about unborn fish, maybe I can argue for unborn bread. The atmosphere is thick with candle smoke and pomp. Seals are pressed, contracts folded, and messengers sent to announce victories of ink and quill. Outside, the carp continue to swim lazily, unaware that their unborn descendants have already been claimed, taxed, and promised. You step back into the sunlight, shaking your head. Prestige isn't just measured in feasts or ponds. It's codified in absurdly worded documents, where fish yet unhatched are spoken of as property. The pond gleams quietly, oblivious, while parchment inside the hall bristles with ambition stretched across centuries. You wander now to a quieter place, an archaeological dig, centuries after the ponds fell silent. The earth has been cut open in neat squares, and trowels scrape gently through layers of mud and clay. Here, carp reveal themselves not as shimmering swimmers, but as fragments, bones, scales, and teeth unearthed from the silt of forgotten ponds. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists frequently discover fish bones in medieval refuse pits and pond sediments. By analyzing these remains, they learn what people ate, how often, and how large the fish grew. Carp bones, in particular, confirm just how central ponds were to diets and feasts in regions like Bohemia, Germany, and England. And the quirky tidbit? Some digs reveal unusual deposits, like piles of carp jawbones kept separately. Scholars speculate they might have been discarded after feasts or even saved as charms. One site yielded so many scales in a single layer that archaeologists joked they'd found a medieval fish market's floor. Imagine kneeling in the dirt, brushing away centuries, and uncovering a glittering line of scales that once gleamed on a banquet plate. You crouch beside the trench, watching as experts measure and bag each find. They murmur about growth rings on bones, isotopes that reveal diet and distribution patterns. From this muddy evidence, they reconstruct stories. Which ponds were drained, which kitchens boiled fish, which households lived in abundance. Historians still argue whether bone deposits represent everyday meals or exceptional feasts, whether carp was common fare or rare delicacy. Joke number 1. Picture an archaeologist proudly announcing, "We found proof of carp feasting," only for a colleague to tease, or proof of very sloppy dishwashing. Joke number 2. Someone brushes dirt from a single carp tooth and declares it monumental evidence. Another mutters, "For the carp dentist, maybe." Joke number 3. Volunteers at the site groan after cataloging their 1,000 fish scale, swearing they'll never order fish again, at least until dinner. The dig is silent, except for scraping tools, the rustle of paper bags, the whisper of wind across ruined embankments. Yet from these tiny bones, entire feasts resurface. The carp, reduced to fragments, still whisper stories of prestige, hunger, and celebration. You step back from the trench, gazing at the grassy hollow where water once shimmered. The pond is gone, the fish long eaten, but in the soil their presence endures, leaving clues for future dreamers who kneel in mud and brush at bones, piecing together the lives of those who counted carp as treasure. You walk eastward in your imagination, following trade roads that stretch beyond the Holy Roman Empire, past Poland, into Hungary and further. At each bend of the road, you notice the same familiar shimmer. Ponds dug, sluices built, carp swimming steadily. It isn't just nobles repeating the trick anymore. It's monks carrying their watery expertise across borders. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Medieval monastic orders were key in spreading fish farming techniques. From Benedictines in France to Cistercians in Bohemia and beyond, monks exported their knowledge of pond construction, water management, and carp breeding. By the 14th and 15th centuries, this expertise had transformed entire landscapes of Central and Eastern Europe into networks of ponds. Now the quirky tidbit. Some monasteries became so proficient that they effectively ran carp industries, producing enough fish to sell in markets hundreds of miles away. Chroniclers describe wagons leaving abbeys stacked with barrels of live carp, their destinations as far-flung as Krakow or Vienna. Imagine monks in robes negotiating fish prices like seasoned merchants, their fingers still ink-stained from copying psalms. You picture one abbey's layout. Churches and cloisters in the center, but radiating outward are ponds like watery spokes, shimmering in the sun. Monks trample on the banks, adjusting gates, tossing scraps, scribbling notes. For them, the ponds were not distractions, but disciplines, living embodiments of order and patience. Historians still argue whether the monks pursued aquaculture primarily as devotion, sustaining fasting diets, or as profit, selling surplus to lay markets. Perhaps both motives swam together. Joke number 1. A monk boasts his pond produced a miracle catch this year. Another mutters, the miracle is that Brother Thomas didn't eat half before counting. Joke number 2. Picture monks chanting psalms while netting carp. Try and keep rhythm as fish slap their robes with muddy tails. Joke number 3. Travelers passing by see monks marching solemnly with buckets of wriggling fish and whisper, are they baptizing them or selling them? The spread of these techniques reshaped landscapes. Hills were terraced into ponds. Forests clear for channels. Villages reorganized around sluices. Carp farming became not just food, but infrastructure, knitting together regions with common methods of managing water and fish. You stand by a pond in Moravia, listening to the quiet splash of monks at work. The same skills that fed abbeys in France now ripple outward, transforming Europe's heartlands into watery grids. In the silent swim of carp, you see a shared tradition, patience, labor, and the steady march of monastic know-how across borders. You find yourself now in a candlelit salon of the 18th century, long after medieval pomp has faded. The wigs are powdered, the jackets satin, and the voice is smooth with enlightenment wit. Around a polished table, urbane gentlemen sip wine and poke fun at old traditions. Carp, once the crown of noble feasts, has become the butt of their jokes. Here's the mainstream historical fact. By the Enlightenment, carp had lost some of its glamour. In refined urban society, it was increasingly viewed as a stodgy, old-fashioned dish, associated with monastic dullness and provincial lords. Writers mock carp as heavy, muddy, and passé compared to new culinary fashions of the era. Lighter sauces, fresh vegetables, and exotic imports like coffee and chocolate. The quirky tidbit? In Parisian circles, to call someone a carp was called them boring, slow, or unrefined. What was once a compliment, abundance, patience, became a sly insult. Imagine someone at the table rolling their eyes and saying, "Don't invite him. He's as lively as a carp." The room sparkles with irony. A philosopher leans back and declares, "Our fathers built ponds as monuments. We build coffee houses instead." Another raises a glass. To progress, may the carp remain in mud where it belongs. Laughter follows and powdered wigs shake. Historians still argue whether this disdain reflected genuine shift in diet or simply fashionable snobbery. Did carp truly fall from tables, or was mocking it just a way of mocking tradition? Joke number 1. A wit at the table quips, "Carp is proof that mud can swim." The crowd roars with laughter, wine nearly spilling. Joke number 2. Another adds, "Carp were the status symbols of my grandfather. My status symbol is never having to eat carp again." Joke number 3. A young noble sighs dramatically, "I courted a lady with a carp supper. She married a man who brought her chocolate." And yet, beneath the jokes, carp ponds lingered on in the countryside. While salons mocked them, villagers still netted fish each season. Monasteries still harvested for Lent, and estates still kept their ponds quietly functional. Prestige may have shifted, but the fish swam on. You lean against a paneled wall, listening to the laughter echo, feeling the sting of satire. Carp, once golden with saffron and hailed in chronicles, now reduced to a metaphor for boredom. Still, you can't help but smile. Prestige changes, fashions shift, but the fish remain as steady as mud and water can be. You drift away from the salon's laughter and step into a new landscape, one buzzer with wheels, hammers, and smoke. It is the 19th century, and the old noble estates are changing. Where ponds once shimmered as quiet mirrors of prestige, many are now reshaped into reservoirs or even small industrial works. The carp still swim, but their watery whirl hums with a different kind of ambition. Here's the mainstream historical fact. During the Industrial Revolution, many estates repurposed or modernized their ponds. Some were enlarged to power mills, others drained to reclaim farmland, and a few adapted into proto-factories for systematic fish production. The link between water and wealth didn't vanish. It simply shifted toward industry and commerce. Now for the quirky tidbit. In certain regions, noble families actually advertise their carp ponds in business-like pamphlets, boasting of efficient yields as though they were selling machinery. Imagine a baron comparing his pond output to a steam engine's horsepower. Nodding gravely as clerks scribbled down numbers. Carp ponds, once romantic, became spreadsheets in muddy disguise. The soundscape is no longer monks chanting or nobles boasting. It's the clang of metal sluices, the shouts of overseers, the hiss of steam nearby. Workers shovel mud in rhythm with machines, hauling loads as carp swirl below. Historians still argue whether this industrial shift meant the end of ponds as status symbols or their transformation into practical enterprises. Were they relics dressed in new clothes or genuine parts of industrial progress? Joke number 1. Picture a noble bragging, "My ponds are fully modernized." His neighbor replies, "So are mine. They produce rust instead of fish." Joke number 2. Carp are weighed and sorted with the precision of machine parts. A clerk grumbles, "At least the fish don't need oiling." Another mutters, "Not yet." Joke number 3. A worker drops a ledger in the mud, sighs, and says, "The carp will file it for us." The landscape feels transitional. The old prestige of feast and symbolism fades, yet ponds persist, stubbornly useful in new ways. They no longer dazzle guests with golden fish, but they still feed markets, power mills, and fertilize fields. Carp, ever adaptable, become quiet participants in the age of steam, just as they were in the age of monks. You stand on the embankment, hearing both water and machinery. The pond surface still ripples in familiar patterns, yet its meaning has shifted again. No longer a noble's mirror, no longer a monk's fast day feast. It is now an industrial reservoir, holding history in its depths as smoke curls above. You leave behind a clamor of machines and walk into silence. The landscape is gentler now. Centuries later, when the ponds lie abandoned, the dikes crumble, sluices rot, reeds choke the water, and frogs reclaim the banks. The carp remain, but without servants or monks to tend them. They live unnoticed, their prestige dissolved into quiet ripples. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Many medieval fish ponds fell out of use by the modern era. Some were drained for farmland, others left to silt over, becoming marshes or meadows. Yet archaeological surveys still reveal their outlines. Ghostly rectangles across Europe's countryside, reminders of a vanished prestige. And the quirky tidbit? In some places, locals whisper that abandoned ponds were haunted. Strange lights, croaking choirs, or giant phantom carp were said to rise on misty nights. The stories may have been nothing more than will-o'-the-wisps and frog choruses, but they gave forgotten ponds an eerie afterlife. You wander along one such overgrown pond. Dragonflies flicker, reeds sigh in the breeze, and a heron lifts heavily into the air. The water is shallow, choked with lily pads, yet beneath, carp still glide. Descendants of fish once tallied in ledgers, once glazed with saffron, once paraded as gifts. Historians still argue whether the endurance of carp in such ponds is evidence of deliberate restocking or simply nature persisting on its own terms. Joke number 1. A villager points to the overgrown pond and says, "That used to be a nobleman's pride." His friend replies, "Now it's just a mosquito buffet." Joke number 2. Children dare each other to swim, whispering, "The ghost carp will nibble your toes." Joke number 3. A modern farmer plows a field and complains when his tractor sinks into mud, muttering, "The carp kept the last laugh." And now, the story slows. The ponds once sang with feasts, with prayers, with laws about unborn fish. They rang with laughter, arguments, punishments, and pride. Now they whisper only with reeds and frogs. The carp still circle in patient silence, their history shimmering faintly under the surface. You sit by the bank, the air soft, the water still. The centuries of drama fade like ripples smoothing out after stones fall. What remains is quiet continuity, mud, water, fish, simple, steady, and strangely soothing. And so, as the story drifts to its close, you sit in stillness by that forgotten pond. The water holds no more banquets, no more bishops' boasts, no more scribes tallying fish. It simply holds silence. The reeds bend gently with the evening breeze, and the surface reflects only sky and clouds. Carp, slow and steady, move beneath, invisible but present, like thoughts half remembered before sleep. Your breathing slows with the rhythm of the pond. Inhale with the soft rustle of reeds. Exhale with the faint ripple of unseen fins. The noises of centuries, clanging kitchens, chanting monks, shouting soldiers, fade into a murmur, as though the world itself has grown drowsy. All that remains is water, mud, and the timeless patience of fish circling calmly below. Let your body feel as heavy as the stones once stacked into dikes. Let your mind drift as lazily as carp in warm shallows. Imagine yourself floating just beneath the surface, weightless, suspended, free of worry. No feast to prepare, no ledgers to balance, no punishments to fear. Only quiet water and the steady drift of time. If your thoughts rise like ripples, let them widen and fade. If memories leap like fish, let them fall gently back into stillness. You are safe here, surrounded by soft reeds and the quiet breath of the earth itself. The night deepens, stars appear, and the pond becomes a mirror of the sky. Your eyelids grow heavy, your breath deepens, and you feel yourself slipping into rest. The carp circle on, eternal and calm, guardians of dreams. Good night. Sleep well.